David had always been one step ahead, hiding in plain sight, until Detective Lara Holt stumbled upon his grisly collection. Now, with every move she makes, he's watching, waiting, and daring her to come closer. But as Holt inches toward the truth, she realizes the game isn't what she thought, and David's disappearance might be the greatest trick of all. David had always been an unremarkable man in the eyes of the world. He blended into society seamlessly, never standing out or drawing attention to himself. His life was carefully constructed to avoid suspicion. He worked a mundane office job, lived alone in a small, tidy apartment, and kept to himself. But beneath this ordinary facade, something far more sinister thrived. For years, David had been secretly living out his darkest impulses. He wasn't like other criminals who acted out of impulsive rage or uncontrolled anger. No, David's method was meticulous, calculated. He chose his victims with the precision of a surgeon, carefully watching them, learning their routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He understood that, in order to keep his secret safe, every step had to be flawless. He needed to leave no evidence, no trace of his presence. It was all about control. His victims were chosen not for their personal connections to him, but for their ability to fit into the disturbing puzzle he was constructing. David saw each life he took as an essential piece of something larger, something that only he could understand. Their disappearances were often unnoticed, at least at first. They blended into the countless other cases of missing persons, and he took comfort in the fact that they would soon be forgotten by everyone but him. But David's real obsession wasn't just with the act of killing, it was with what came after. He had a dark compulsion to collect. Each victim became a part of a grotesque archive, hidden away from the world in a place no one would ever think to look. The bodies were kept in various locations around the city, carefully preserved and arranged. They were his trophies, his reminders of power, his testament to the control he held over life and death. For years, David's secret remained hidden, his actions unnoticed by those around him. His world was one of silence, of darkness, and of deep, twisted satisfaction. Little did he know, though, that the first crack in his carefully constructed empire was beginning to form. Detective Lara Holt was no stranger to strange disappearances, but there was something different about this case. The missing persons reports had started to pile up in the last few months, 5 in total, all vanishing without a trace. At first, they seemed like isolated incidents, but as Holt reviewed the details, something nagged at her. The victims were from all walks of life: a young woman just starting college, a middle-aged man with no known enemies, an elderly woman who lived alone. What they shared, however, was the peculiar way they had vanished, without a sound, without a sign of struggle. It was as if they had simply walked off the face of the earth. Holt's instincts told her this wasn't random. There was something deliberate about it, something calculated. But what was it? She spent days reviewing the case files, retracing the victim's last known movements. The common thread was elusive, slipping through her fingers every time she thought she had found it. Yet the pattern was clear enough that she couldn't ignore it. The disappearances occurred on quiet, uneventful nights when the city felt almost deserted. It was as if someone had been waiting for the right moment when no one would notice. With each report, Holt began to see the faintest of connections. One of the victims had visited a local cafe the night before she disappeared. Another had attended a late-night concert at a venue near the other disappearances. But it wasn't until Holt looked at the list of names in the missing persons reports that the unsettling thought crossed her mind. What if the killer had been watching them all along? What if someone had been keeping track of every move they made, waiting for the right time to strike? There was no evidence, no eyewitnesses, and yet Holt felt the deepening certainty that the answers were hidden somewhere she hadn't yet looked. The case was slipping through her fingers, and the more she investigated, the more she felt the silent weight of something darker lurking just beneath the surface. Someone, or something, was watching her now too. The more Holt investigated, the deeper she sank into the mystery of the disappearances. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, something right in front of her, but just out of reach. The victims didn't appear to have any common link, yet Holt couldn't deny the eerie pattern forming before her eyes. Each disappearance had occurred during quiet hours, often when the city seemed to fall into a deep, almost unnatural silence. It wasn't the randomness of the crimes that unsettled her. It was the methodical nature of them. This wasn't the work of an unhinged criminal acting out of rage or passion. No, this killer was something else. Holt decided to dig into the victims' lives further, looking for any connection she might have missed. She scoured through their social media profiles, interviewed friends, family, and colleagues. Nothing stood out. The victims didn't have any obvious enemies or dark pasts. Some had no significant connections to anyone at all. But the more she looked into their daily routines, the more she began to see that each of them had unknowingly crossed paths with one person, David. At first it was a coincidence. David was a quiet man with a routine of his own. Nothing extraordinary, no glaring red flags. But as Holt continued to trace his movements, she realized he had been in close proximity to every one of the missing persons in the days leading up to their disappearances. He had seen them, interacted with them in passing, or had even been at the same events. There was no evidence that he had been involved directly, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. David had no criminal record, no known associations with any of the victims, but Holt couldn't shake the thought that he might be more than just an innocent bystander. It was as if he had been watching them, waiting for the right moment. Something in her gut told her that David was at the center of it all. She couldn't yet prove it, but the deeper she dug, the clearer it became. David was not just a part of this case. He was the key. Holt's instincts told her that David was the key to unraveling this case, but finding the concrete evidence she needed was proving to be an elusive task. She spent countless hours reviewing every scrap of information she had gathered about him. David had a clean record, no arrests, no history of violence. His neighbors described him as quiet, almost invisible. He had no known ties to any criminal activity, and on the surface he seemed like a man who simply lived a quiet, uneventful life. But Holt had learned over the years that the most dangerous predators often blend in the best, hiding their true nature behind the mundane. There was one detail, however, that she couldn't ignore. David had been spotted near several of the places where the victims had last been seen, sometimes days before they vanished. At first, Holt thought it was a coincidence. After all, he lived in the same city, frequented some of the same spots, but the frequency with which he appeared near the victims' locations couldn't be brushed off as mere chance. Something wasn't right. Determined to find more, Holt turned to the logistics of David's life. She started digging into his spending, habits, his bank records, looking for anything that might offer a clue to his movements. That's when she uncovered an unexpected lead. David had been making regular purchases from an industrial supply store on the outskirts of town. The store sold cleaning agents and other supplies used in industrial settings. Holt was intrigued. While it was not unusual for people to purchase such items for their homes, David's repeated visits, sometimes buying in bulk, seemed odd. She couldn't help but wonder what he needed them for. The purchases were made late at night, around the time when some of the victims had disappeared. Holt couldn't ignore the growing feeling that David was preparing something dark and hidden. She knew she was close. Every thread she pulled seemed to lead her back to one place, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was isolated, off the beaten path, and had been abandoned for years. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. David's carefully constructed world was starting to crack open, and Holt could feel the urgency rising within her. The warehouse was her next destination, and she had to act fast before David realized the net was closing in on him. Holt knew she was on the brink of something big, but with each passing hour, the pressure to find David before he disappeared again intensified. Her investigation into the industrial cleaning supplies had led her to the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, but the search still felt like an enormous leap of faith. There were no guarantees. The warehouse had been empty for years, and she couldn't be certain that David had any connection to it beyond the suspicious purchases. But something deep in her gut told her that this was where everything would come together. The raid was scheduled carefully, with a team of officers and forensic experts ready to move in. Holt felt a nervous excitement. This was the moment that could make or break the case. They had planned every detail down to the smallest precaution. Still, as they approached the desolate warehouse at the edge of the city, she couldn't shake the unease creeping over her. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. When the team breached the door, the sight inside confirmed Holt's darkest suspicions. The warehouse was nothing like she had imagined. It was a grotesque scene, an abomination of human remains. The walls were lined with rows of bodies, each one positioned in meticulously arranged poses, some frozen in unnatural angles, others holding objects that seemed eerily symbolic. It was a display, a twisted exhibition of control and power, each victim a marker in David's grotesque journey. The forensic team immediately began to assess the remains, their faces pale, as they realized the enormity of what they were witnessing. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition, some of them older than others, but all of them arranged with terrifying care. There were no obvious signs of violent struggle or physical wounds. It was as though David had carefully selected his victims and ensured that they would be preserved for his personal collection. It was clear now that David hadn't just been killing for the sake of it. He had been building something far more chilling than anyone had imagined. But as the team began to process the evidence, Holt's heart sank. There was no sign of David. No clues, no footprints, no traces of his presence. The warehouse, filled with the horror of his collection, was empty of the one thing she had hoped to find, David himself. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a grotesque display and a trail of questions. Had he known they were coming? Was he watching them now? Holt didn't know, but one thing was certain. David was playing a game, and she was only just beginning to understand the rules. As Holt and her team scoured the warehouse, the realization began to sink in. They had found a macabre collection, but David was nowhere to be found. It was as though the man had vanished into thin air. The bodies, each one preserved and arranged in eerie displays, left no doubt that they had been meticulously chosen and hidden. But there were no clues as to how David had pulled off such an elaborate scheme without anyone noticing. The more they investigated, the more they realized how thoroughly he had planned everything, from the bodies he collected to the places he chose to hide them. The team worked tirelessly, documenting the bodies and collecting evidence. But Holt's mind kept drifting back to David's disappearance. How had he managed to leave behind such a chilling display and slip away so easily? There were no signs of forced entry into the warehouse, no broken windows or signs of struggle. It was as if he had simply walked out, leaving everything behind: the carefully arranged corpses, the cleaning supplies, the absence of any personal belongings. It was all too deliberate. Holt couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. David had always been methodical, a step ahead at every turn. This was his world, his creation, and they were just intruders, fumbling through it. She spent hours poring over the forensic reports, trying to piece together any shred of information that might lead her to David's whereabouts. But every lead turned cold. No surveillance footage, no fingerprints, nothing that could identify where David had gone or how he had slipped away. It was as if he had prepared for this moment, knowing that the authorities would eventually close in on him. Days passed, and Holt grew more frustrated. The feeling of being watched started to gnaw at her. Every time she stepped into her office, it felt like someone was there, just out of sight, observing her every move. The lack of answers, the unexplainable disappearance of David, filled her with a growing unease. The case was slipping through her fingers, and she was beginning to realize that David wasn't just hiding, he was playing a game, and he had no intention of letting her win. As the days stretched into weeks, Holt's frustration grew. The case had gone cold, and despite her best efforts, David remained elusive. Every lead she pursued seemed to end in a dead end. No one had seen him leave the warehouse, and there was no evidence pointing to his whereabouts. The city's streets felt emptier, quieter, and Holt began to feel the oppressive weight of being on the edge of a vast, unsolved puzzle. The sensation that David was out there, watching her every move, gnawed at her. The pressure mounted with each passing day. Holt couldn't stop thinking about the warehouse, the bodies, and the chilling thought that David had been preparing for this moment all along. His disappearance didn't feel like a simple escape. It felt calculated, as if he had anticipated the day the police would close in on him and had already planned his next move. She had no proof of this, but her instincts told her that he was still out there somewhere, keeping a watchful eye on the investigation. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, but Holt knew better. He was playing a game, and she was simply one piece on his board. Every time Holt reviewed the evidence, she felt a deeper sense of unease. The bodies in the warehouse, the bizarre way they had been arranged, were reminders that David wasn't acting on impulse. He was methodical, calculating, and he had been waiting for this moment for years. Holt couldn't shake the thought that he had deliberately set this trap for her, leaving behind enough to keep her coming closer, but never enough to capture him. As the search widened to neighboring cities and other regions, Holt's frustration reached its peak. There were no sightings of David, no confirmed reports of him anywhere. It was as if he had slipped through the cracks, becoming a ghost. The more she thought about it, the more she realized the terrifying truth. David had planned for this. He had been preparing for his disappearance, and now, with no leads to follow, Holt was left wondering if he was ever truly going to be found. The case, once brimming with promise, now felt like an endless maze. Each turn led her deeper into uncertainty, with no clear way out. Holt was stuck, unsure if the man she had been hunting was ever truly caught, or if he had just been waiting for this moment to slip away, leaving behind only unsettling questions. As weeks turned into months, Holt found herself consumed by the case. David's disappearance was no longer just a case to solve. It had become an obsession. The warehouse, with its grotesque displays and unsettling silence, continued to haunt her thoughts. The bodies, arranged with twisted care, felt like a personal challenge. She could almost hear David's taunting laughter, a whisper in the back of her mind reminding her that he was still out there, always one step ahead. The more she obsessed over the case, the more it seemed like David was deliberately toying with her. It wasn't just that he had escaped, it was the way he had done it. The man was a ghost, leaving behind nothing but his disturbing collection, and it was clear to Holt that he had been planning this moment for far longer than she had anticipated. The meticulous care with which he had hidden the bodies, the unusual cleaning supplies, and the strange details of his disappearances all pointed to one thing. David wasn't just running from the law, he was playing a game. And the rules of that game were simple. He would always be in control. Holt spent her nights poring over every detail she could find about David's life, trying to find a clue that would lead her to him. She re-examined the evidence, spoke to people who knew him, searched through old photographs and combed through reports. But the deeper she went, the more isolated she felt. It was as if David had planned every aspect of this, his disappearance, his destruction of evidence, the way he had erased all traces of himself from the world. Holt couldn't escape the growing sense that she was trapped in a cycle, a loop where every answer only led to more questions. Then, one night, just as Holt was about to give in to the crushing weight of uncertainty, she received a cryptic letter. It was addressed to her personally, written in a neat, deliberate hand. The message inside sent a shiver down her spine. "You're closer than you think. I'm watching always, but the game's not over yet. You'll never find me, detective." The letter was chilling in its simplicity, but it was also a twisted confirmation of her fears. David had been watching her all along, and now, with this message, he was daring her to continue the hunt. The game wasn't over, and Holt knew that this was far from a victory. In fact, it felt like it was only the beginning. David wasn't just evading capture, he was pushing her to go further, to keep looking, and she would have to play along, if she ever hoped to uncover the full truth. The letter was a haunting confirmation of everything Holt had feared. David was still out there, still playing his twisted game. The message was chilling, its coldness sending a shiver through her spine as she sat in her office late that night, staring at the words. She could feel his presence in every letter, in every line, a reminder that he was always one step ahead, manipulating her every move. Holt's pulse quickened as she realized the depth of his mind games. David wasn't just hiding, he was watching her, testing her resolve. The letter was a puzzle in itself, and Holt couldn't let it go. Every detail, every word, felt like a clue. She studied the handwriting, hoping to find something, anything that could lead her to him. But it was perfect, neat, deliberate, as if crafted to give her just enough hope to keep searching. The message was a taunt, designed to lure her back into the hunt, to reignite her obsession. And it worked. But Holt couldn't afford to get lost in his game. She knew David was manipulative, a master of control, and the last thing she could allow was for him to dictate the pace of the investigation. The letter hinted at something, a sense of proximity. Closer than you think. What did that mean? Was David taunting her from nearby, watching her every move from the shadows? Or was it just another one of his elaborate tricks? The frustration of being so close yet so far gnawed at Holt. She dove back into her work, re-examining the evidence, looking for new leads. The letter felt like a crossroads. Holt could either accept it as a game, one she'd never win, or she could take the bait and push further. She chose the latter. The pursuit of David was no longer just about solving the case. It was personal now. She needed to end this, to take back control. But as the investigation intensified, Holt began to notice strange things. Her phone seemed to glitch at odd moments. Shadows seemed to follow her in the corners of her vision. She wasn't sure if it was her paranoia or something more sinister, but one thing was clear. David was still out there, and he was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The next move was hers, but it felt like David was always a step ahead, leading her down a path that she wasn't sure she could escape from. The game had changed. Holt could feel it in every fiber of her being. The pressure was mounting, the walls closing in. David had turned the tables, and now, more than ever, Holt knew that she had no choice but to play along. The cryptic letter had shaken her, but it also lit a fire within her. It was a call to action, and she wasn't about to let him have the last word. The hunt for David had become personal, more than a case, more than a pursuit. It was a battle for control, and Holt wasn't about to lose. She dove deeper into her investigation, combing through every scrap of evidence once more. Each new lead felt like a delicate thread, unraveling further into an intricate web. The city, once a familiar landscape, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, each corner hiding something dark. Holt couldn't help but wonder how many other places David had hidden, how many other puzzles he had left for her to find. She knew he was still watching her, always lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to make the next move. Then came another letter. This time, it was different. Instead of words, the envelope contained a photograph of Holt herself. It was taken from a distance, just outside her office building, the edges blurred as if it had been snapped in a hurry. She stared at the photo for a long moment, the unsettling feeling creeping back into her chest. David was closer than ever, and now he was in her world, observing every move she made. Holt felt a wave of unease wash over her. David had crossed the line. He wasn't just playing a game anymore. He was toying with her, pulling her deeper into his web. She knew the stakes had never been higher. David wasn't just hiding, he was right in front of her, manipulating every decision she made. In that moment, Holt made a decision. She would take back control. This game wasn't over, but it was time to turn the tables. Holt had no choice but to keep pushing forward, to draw him out. She had already come too far to back down now, but as she planned her next steps, a chilling thought struck her. Was this game meant to lead her to David, or was it always meant to lead her somewhere far darker? The hunt for the truth was far from over, and Holt had to confront the terrifying reality that even if she found David, she might never truly escape him.